Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Van Huss, and I'm the Senior Director of Programs and Partnerships here at the Olmsted Network. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar explores the past, present, and future of Elk Rock Garden in Portland, Oregon. We'll hear from public historian Eileen Fitzsimons on the creation of the property, and then Executive Director Stephanie Donovan Brown on its ongoing preservation. We'll end with a Q&A. This conversation also serves as a preview of our upcoming luncheon at Elk Rock ahead of our 2026 annual conference happening on September 23rd through 25th. We'll drop links in the chat box and hope to see you there. Until then, I'm pleased to pass it over to Eileen. Thank you.
Greetings from Portland, Oregon. I'm pleased to be sharing some of my research on the history of Elk Rock Garden in advance of your visit to the Olmsted Conference in September. Many of you know more about the history of the Olmsted firm than me, so I will focus on Peter Kerr, who was the tenant, property owner, and garden creator at Elk Rock for 60 years. I will clarify the contributions of John C. Olmsted, members of the firm after his death, and those of a former Olmsted employee, Emanuel Tillman Mish. Born in 1861, Peter Kerr was raised in Newton Stewart, a small agricultural town in southwestern Scotland. His parents and their 8 children lived in apartments over the bank managed by their father. Located between the primary business street and the River Cree, there was no adjacent play area. However, the bank provided a walled garden above the town, and it was here that the Kerr children were taught by their mother how to cultivate flowers, vegetables, and soft fruits. There was also a small greenhouse behind the bank for starting seeds and growing cuttings. In addition, their father leased a 200-acre farm just a mile from the village that the children often visited. It had a pond, pastures for a dairy herd, poultry, and extensive vegetable gardens. Much of the farm's output was used by Mrs. Kerr to provide meals for her family of 10. As they grew older, the children were encouraged to roam the woods, moors, and rivers that are just still a 10-minute walk from town. Although there were some large estates around Newton Stewart, they were inaccessible both physically and socially to the Kerr family. The exception was the nearby decrepit property of an individual who spent the family fortune on the creation of a notable garden. By Peter's youth, it was overgrown, but he recorded wandering through it on several occasions. He developed a critical eye for well-grown plants at the annual horticultural show where cottagers vied with each other for prizes. The one in Newton Stewart was staged in the city hall next to the bank. Winners were announced in the local newspaper and awards presented by the local Earl of Galloway. The practical lessons learned from his mother, the productivity of a small mixed farm, living in a community that valued horticultural skills, and the pleasures and solace of nature were experiences that Kerr treasured throughout his life. Like his siblings, Peter was educated in a local school through our equivalent of 8th grade. He did well in all general subjects, receiving high marks in Latin and drawing, skills he would employ 20 years later when making his own garden. After 3 years training in his father's bank, Peter was offered a position at a London branch. At age 17, he traveled by train to the metropolis, where he was met by his older brother. He was unprepared for the size and population of the city on this, his first visit. An estimated 1 million people entered and left London daily, in addition to the 4.5 million who lived there. It was crowded, noisy, and dirty. In his diary, Peter's impressions were confused, bewildered, astonished. He missed his family, the natural beauty of Galloway, and his mother's cooking. However, he ordered himself to make his money in London, but spend it in Scotland. After 3 months as a bank messenger, he was offered a job in the commodities trading firm of Dewar and Webb, where one of the partners was his uncle James Dewar. The business bought and sold grain, arranging shipping from ports around the world. For the next 8 years, Peter absorbed every aspect of global commodities trading, while in his free time, he attended lectures, plays, debates, concerts, industrial exhibits, museums, and flower shows. Escaping his rooming house, he visited his uncle's home in suburban Putney, where he worked in the garden, weeding, pruning, and mowing the lawn. The small villa was near the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and for 2 years Peter lived in nearby Richmond, recording many visits to Kew. He was entitled to a month's vacation, which was sometimes shortened, but always spent in Newton Stewart, hiking and working in the walled garden. In 1888, Dewar and Webb sent Peter to Portland. He arrived in the city, the largest in the state, with a population of about 45,000 residents. After 3 months in Portland, at the grayest, wettest, and coldest time of the year, he was reassigned to San Francisco, where he rented lodgings outside of the city, enjoying the mild weather and the spring wildflowers. 8 months later, he was sent on to New Zealand and Australia for a year and a half. Finally, he was posted to Argentina. Grain sales were in a slump. He found the heat and humidity of Buenos Aires enervating, and after 6 months asked to be relieved. He made no entries in his daily diary about the exotic flora of any of these countries. In late 1892, he returned to Portland, where Dewar and Webb had decided to open a branch office. In the 40-plus years since its founding, some Portland residents had grown wealthy from an economy based on timber harvesting, salmon packing, and gold mining, as well as banking, real estate sales, and trade. Peter was a participant, but not yet a beneficiary of this economic expansion. Cultivation of the dry lands on the eastern side of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon and Washington were producing bountiful crops of grain, primarily wheat, which was shipped around Cape Horn to Europe, usually England. But as he settled into his boarding house, a global recession was beginning that extended almost to the end of the century. Fortunately, Peter was a salaried employee, but as he struggled to generate sales, individuals who had invested in large tracts of land on the outskirts of Portland were selling their properties at bargain prices. 4 years after his arrival in Portland, he learned that a foreclosed 2-year-old Queen Anne-style house on almost 3 acres of land was available for rent. It was 6 miles upstream from the city, but a recently opened commuter railroad was located on the Willamette River below. By this time, one of his younger brothers, Tom, and Patrick Gifford, a friend from their hometown in Scotland, had arrived to help in the business, and the three men moved to the property on May Day, 1897. Their living quarters, dubbed the Cliff Cottage, was built on a plateau located several hundred feet above the river. Its deep porch faced a view of Mount Hood, 80 miles to the east, and on the south side was a pasture with scattered clusters of the native white oak and Douglas fir. West of the house was another almost 3-acre tract that rose up a steep hillside that had been logged off. The renters put their dormant gardening skills to immediate use. The rough pasture was seeded and transformed into a smooth, grass-surface tennis court enclosed in wire fencing. The eastern edge of the property, which dropped down a rocky slope to the railroad tracks, was defined by a low stone wall built by the tenants. Although they rented only the house and acreage surrounding it, the owner of the 10-acre tract to the south allowed them to extend the wall to the southern boundary atop Elk Rock. A path was established parallel to the wall that crossed over a dry gully via a rustic bridge and beyond a cement-lined pond filled by a natural seep. The pond was apparently constructed for a previous property owner, and it still exists, as do the rock walls and paths. In addition to the tennis court, a rudimentary driving range and putting green were added. The three bachelors had not golfed in Scotland, but were members of the newly established Waverley Golf Club on the far side of the river, just north of the town of Milwaukee. The third landscape improvement was creation of a large vegetable garden that stretched up the western hillside to a narrow, naturally occurring shelf of land. Here, a low shed was added to house poultry and laundry facilities. The products were used for meals prepared by Yen Benqing, the Chinese cook and houseman. The Cliff Cottage amenities proved to be a social draw for young Portlanders who came by horse or train as couples and singles to play tennis, improve their golfing skills, drink tea on the porch, or stroll the paths to viewpoints of the river and 15-acre Elk Rock Island. 3 years after their arrival, Tom Kerr married and moved into Portland. Other bachelors took his place, and finally in 1905, at the age of 44, Peter married as well. He and his wife Lori became the sole residents of Cliff Cottage, and their 2 daughters soon arrived in 1906 and 1908. By the time of his marriage, Peter had purchased all 3 lots that make up the Elk Rock estate, totaling 13 acres. Many fruit trees were planted, and a second shed was built for a cow. Peter redesigned the sloping vegetable garden into a series of long terraces with a path in the middle, accented by a tall rose-covered pergola. This arrangement was featured in a 1915 book, Beautiful Gardens in America. The Consultant. In 1909, John C. Olmsted was a familiar figure in Portland. He first arrived in 1903 to shape the city's 1905 trade fair, the Lewis and Clark Exposition. He was also serving as a consultant to the city's Park Commission, which wanted guidance on a master plan for public parks. At least 34 individuals, many of them friends of Peter and Lori, hired Olmsted to advise on new suburban estates. While the Kerrs could not afford to build a new home, they wanted Olmsted's advice on several matters. The Cliff Cottage, built as an uninsulated summer residence heated with fireplaces, was cramped and uncomfortable. The couple owned a 5-acre lot next to the golf course on the other side of the river. Should they consider a future move? Peter wanted a professional evaluation of his garden, now almost 13 years old. The grain commission business was volatile, and sales had been poor for several years. In case they had to sell part of the Elk Rock property, the Kerrs needed a subdivision plan. John Olmsted visited in December 1909. Following a tour of the Elk Rock property, he was rode to the Waverly site and examined it as well. As he departed, he requested a contour map of the Elk Rock property. Within 2 weeks, he provided a 10-page report to the Kerrs. He thought that Peter's garden was very well done. However, he observed that fruit trees had been planted promiscuously across the lawns, and they could be moved and espaliered in the vegetable terraces. He suggested that a future house might be placed at the foot of the western hill and terraced gardens. This would leave the lawns open, but by moving it away from the bluff would eliminate the view of the crude and ugly town of Milwaukee. Peter had considered filling in the dry gully, but Olmsted proposed its transformation into an attractive water feature with an arched stone bridge. Instead of the flat, straight path that ran along the base of the terraces, a curved one would be more graceful, and it was thought that a second pergola would anchor the paths between the north and south lawns. If possible, Olmsted advised remaining at Elk Rock, which had a superior view of the Cascade Mountains. He was aware that Peter was an experienced gardener, and while the Waverly lot would be finished in a short time, Elk Rock would engage him for a lifetime. The Kerrs thanked Olmsted for his report, but explained they were unable to build immediately. In Olmsted's enthusiasm for the possibilities of Elk Rock, in March he produced a preliminary plan that showed a suggested location for a new house. Peter paid the charges, tripled the initial fee, and wrote that a bad season in business would delay implementation of any of Olmsted's suggestions. While the couple appeared prosperous, they were not, and struggled financially to remain at Elk Rock. They sold the Waverly lot, and then 3 years later, Peter wrote a letter to a friend offering to sell his entire property. No response has been found, but the Kerrs managed to remain for another year when fortuitous grain sales at the outbreak of the First World War enabled them to build a new house at Elk Rock. The couple had had 10 years of marriage to create a detailed 2.5-page list of features they wanted in their new house. It was to be placed carefully within an 18-year-old garden, retaining as much of the lawn as possible. Hoping for 2 greenhouses, Peter settled for one. The terrace gardens would remain, but the tennis court and Laurie's round cutting garden would have to be relocated. The architects agreed with the positioning of the new house at the foot of the terrace gardens, as well as Olmsted's opinion that it be aligned to the eastern view. Excavations began in April 1916 under the supervision of a Scottish contractor, and the house was completed by late 1917. As construction began, the architects, Ellis Lawrence and William Holford, may have introduced Emanuel Tillman Mish to the Kerrs. Between 1898 and 1907, he was an employee of the Olmsted office in Brookline. With a degree from the Missouri Botanical Institute, a year of training at Kew, and 6 months at the Arnold Arboretum, his skills as a plantsman were highly valued by the firm. From 1908 to 1914, Mish served as Portland's first city parks director, and during these years implemented many of John Olmsted's plans for several public parks. Although the Olmsted firm wanted to rehire him after he left the city, Mish was determined to establish his own landscape design business. Lawrence and Holford had worked with him on several of his park projects, and they supported his search for work. As construction of the Kerr house began, Mish provided some design work, including a grading plan around the house and connections between the entry, garage, and forecourt. In January 1917, he completed a planting plan for the property except for the terrace gardens. At the time of these drawings, Mish was traveling between Portland and California, and it is not known if he visited the site of the new house. His plant suggestions were repetitive, showing large blocks of identical material, some unsuitable for their location. It is unclear how much of his plan was carried out by Kerr. Mish is responsible for the 2 giant sequoias that mark the garden entry, and autochromes of the forecourt reveal many spring flowering crab apples and cherries whose blossoms soften the severe gray surfaces of the house. As Mrs. Kerr's flower garden on the lawn had vanished, in 1922, Mish created a final planting plan for her on the hillside west of the house. This was the only formal element in the garden, a series of triangular boxwood hedges with a rose pergola above. This feature survives, although the enclosures were replanted with witch hazel when the property changed ownership. In addition to the Olmsted firm and the contributions of E.T. Mish, another professional designer had a major impact on the garden at Elk Rock. Adolf Meyer trained as a landscape architect in Geneva, Switzerland. Arriving in Portland around 1914, he initially worked at a nursery in the city. By some means, he was introduced to Peter Kerr, who engaged him to demolish his terrace gardens, excavate the hillside for a 100-foot-long tennis court, and design an adjacent rock garden. Meyer built dry stone walls throughout the garden, including flights of stone steps, a grotto, and a water bowl that filled from underground seeps and springs. He probably built the 4 pools that make up the Cascades. Colorful, spring-blooming plants were inserted into pockets in the rock wall behind the tennis court, and the iconic purple wisteria was planted. By the time the construction of the house and garden were complete, Peter was 61, Laurie was 45, and it was time to enjoy their new home. Peter engaged the services of the Olmsted firm on 2 more occasions. In 1929, he wrote to Brookline. In the following year, the annual conference of the Garden Club of America was to be held in the Pacific Northwest for the first time, and Elk Rock was on its tour. Following John Olmsted's death in 1920, the firm continued under the direction of Fred Dawson, who asked their West Coast representative, Hammond Sadler, to meet with Kerr. Most of Sadler's 3 pages of advice were directed at tidying Kerr's unrestful borders. the result of his continual plant acquisitions and experiments. Since Kerr would be paying a consulting fee and expenses, in addition to suggestions about his personal garden, he wanted advice on a larger issue, a plan for 600 acres of undeveloped land to the southwest of Elk Rock. In the early 1900s, he bought a 30-acre share in a tract known as Irving Park. As the other 19 investors died or sold their shares, Kerr purchased many of them. Now there were just a few investors who felt the time was right to divide the land into 5 to 10 acre estates with a shared park or golf course. In June 1929, Sadler toured the Irving Park site, issuing several pages of observations and estimated costs for a rough plan. This included a survey and layout of roadways, water, and sewer lines. While the property owners discussed the recommendations and costs, 3 months later, the stock market crash triggered the Great Depression and the plan was shelved. Kerr eventually owned all of the land, on which he pastured cattle and horses for one of his granddaughters. Several years after his death, his descendants sold the property for a mix of housing and commercial uses known as Mountain Park. Some of the money from the sale was placed in an endowment to support maintenance of the garden at Elk Rock. Some of the initial decisions about the landscape at Elk Rock, the addition of the tennis court, driving range, vegetable garden, rock walls, and primary paths were made by the three bachelors. After his marriage, Peter sought the opinions of professionals whose work he held in high regard. John Olmsted and members of the firm must have enjoyed their interactions with their client, a well-traveled, experienced gardener who gave thoughtful consideration to their ideas. Many of their suggestions were affected over time after Kerr balanced the limitations of the site, its thin soil, lack of water and sunlight, against the size of his budget. He created a hybrid garden, retaining many of the existing native trees, Oregon white oak, Douglas fir, and madrone, while mixing native plants such as erythronium, trillium, red currant, mock orange, and Oregon grape with daffodils, snowdrops, and foxgloves, familiar from his earliest gardening years in Scotland. Peter Kerr gardened and experimented to the end of his very long life. After repurposing the tennis court as a victory garden during the Second World War, he planted magnolias that at his age he would never see bloom. He remained curious about plants. I found a note from a nursery near Seattle whose owner identified a plant from a leaf Kerr had sent him. It was dated just 2 months before his death in 1957 at the age of 95. Provision had not been made for the future of the property, and his wife and daughters donated it to the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon, which moved their offices into the house in 1959. The sole requirement of the family was that the garden be open to the public, which it was until 2022, when the property was offered for sale. Dismay about its loss to redevelopment was expressed by many visitors who had come to cherish the garden for 63 years. After a year of uncertainty, the purchase price was raised by a consortium of Kerr descendants, a supportive neighbor, and a substantial loan. The garden and house were recently recommended for placement on the National Register of Historic Places. It is now owned by the nonprofit organization Elk Rock Garden, and Stephanie, who is the executive director, will share some of the plans for the property. Thank you.
My name is Stephanie Brown, and I'm the executive director here at Elk Rock Garden, where, as we say on our website, history blooms and a sustainable future is taking root. As Eileen just shared, the garden got its start almost 130 years ago. For decades, it was lovingly curated by the Kerr family. And then when Peter Kerr passed away in the late 1950s, as Eileen said, it was donated to the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon with the stipulation that it be open to the public. It has been open to the public free of charge since 1959. In 1994, the Elk Rock Garden Foundation was formed with the intention of helping the diocese care for and preserve the garden. And in 2022, when the diocese announced its plans to sell the garden, descendants of Peter Kerr, along with a group of incredibly passionate and generous community members, banded together to assist the nonprofit in purchasing the garden and save it from development. Without that intervention, the garden may well have been lost forever. Our staff, board, and volunteers work to conserve, restore, and enhance the historic Elk Rock Garden property to serve as a nationally recognized garden and center for learning, where partner organizations and people of all ages and backgrounds can collaborate on nature-based solutions to improve the health and beauty of our community. We are particularly focused on providing hands-on learning opportunities that promote biodiversity and climate-resilient conservation and gardening practices. In practice, what this looks like is providing office space and opportunities for collaboration with mission-aligned tenant partners that share our building, including the Hardy Plant Society of Oregon, which teaches its members about hardy plants and gardening through workshops, lectures, and tours of gardens and nurseries. They also operate a horticultural reading room here in the Elk Rock Garden Library. We also share our space with Willamette Riverkeeper, which works to restore and protect the Willamette River. And we have a third partner, the ISLE Project, which provides after-school and summertime science and ecology camps and workshops to middle school students in the Portland metro area. But we also have an amazing community of partners not based here at the garden who help us understand for and care for this beautiful historic place. For example, we regularly partner with the West Multnomah Water and Soil Conservation District. They have helped us with invasive plant removal, have set up a monitoring station for tracking the presence of invasive Mediterranean oak borers, host free public presentations at the garden, teaching the public how to identify and care for native oak and ash trees. And they've been working with us, our arborist, and an expert from Oregon State University to develop a long-term care plan for our 250-year-old native oak trees. Additionally, we've been delighted to provide educational opportunities such as garden tours and lectures that we produce in-house, and other learning opportunities we provide through community partnerships like our work with Clatsop Community College, their historic preservation program, which brought students to the garden for 2 days in February 2025 to return 15 of our historic wood windows to good working order. Last September, we also hosted students from the University of Oregon's Pacific Northwest Field School and a variety of instructors, including university faculty and carpentry, masonry, and cultural landscape experts from the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office, who spent 3 weeks here on site, living and working, making repairs to the manor house, the garden, and the landscape. We also welcome students from Clatsop Community College and Portland Community College to learn skills in plant identification. And a group of Portland Community College's interior design students adopted our visitor center recently and made suggestions for improving the visitor experience. Currently, we have an intern from Portland Community College who, with the assistance of the Oregon Department of Forestry, is creating a 3D topographical map of our property, including the location, size, and species of every significant tree and shrub on the property. This GIS-based map will guide us in beginning to create a conservation plan for our property later this year. Earlier this year, we worked with my co-presenter Eileen to submit a nomination to have the Elk Rock Garden property listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And recently we crossed the first hurdle with that nomination. Just a few weeks ago, the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation voted unanimously to advance our nomination to the National Park Service. Thank you to the Olmsted Network for providing a letter of support. Speaking of the Olmsted Network, earlier this year, we were delighted to be added to the National Olmsted Trail map, joining a long list of landscapes that have shaped American outdoor life. And we are beyond excited to be hosting the Olmsted Network at Elk Rock Garden this September for a salon exploring the remarkable and often overlooked legacy of Olmsted-designed private estates and residential communities across Portland and the Pacific Northwest. This gathering will take place the day before this year's annual Olmsted Conference, which will also be held here in Portland. What I hope you will take away from all that we have shared today is that Elk Rock Garden's story has never been just about a beautiful landscape. Rather, it has been about the people who have chosen again and again for over a century to nurture it and learn from it. From the Kerr family who created and cared for it, to the diocese that welcomed the public, to the community members who have volunteered here for decades and who stepped in to save it in 2022. And now we have an amazing constellation of partners, students, instructors, conservation districts, historians, scientists, tenant organizations, all who show up to teach, learn, and preserve this place alongside us. As we move towards our National Registered listing and make preparations to welcome the Olmsted Network this fall, we're not just protecting and sharing a historic place, we're building the next chapter, and we welcome all who would like to be a part of that story. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was great. And Eileen, thank you. Let's see. We don't have many questions yet. So if you do have questions, I encourage you to drop them in the Q&A box or the chat box. Clara asks, what sort of projects are happening in the garden today?
Well, let me think about that. We actually have a really nice new partnership with the Easter Seals organization. They have a job skills training program for folks who are over 55 and recent immigrants from other countries. And so about 2 weeks ago, we got some long needed garden help. We have a single gardener here managing our 9 acres of garden. And Edmundo, who recently joined us, came here from Cuba. He has a horticulture degree and worked in the sugarcane industry for a long time. But as part of this program with Easter Seals, he's here 20 hours a week working alongside our gardener, Nico, helping with pruning, planting, weeding, plant propagation, all of the things that Nico has needed help with for a long time and hasn't had. So we're super delighted to have him here. I think referenced it a few minutes ago, but we are gearing up later this year to start work on a conservation plan for the whole garden. I think it's an interesting thing. We're a garden that's been around for 129 years, yet our organization is sort of in its infancy in a way. We took ownership of the property in 2023. I joined in 2024, and we've spent the last year and a half just trying to understand the needs of the garden and its infrastructure and its architecture, and have started with preservation of our physical resources like the manor house, but what everybody cares about is the garden, and we've been kind of putting all of the pieces in place to move forward with preservation and restoration of the garden. So we have a lot of exciting things coming up in that regard.
So to kind of piggyback on that, are you prepping for like a cultural landscape survey?
That's a good question. One of the things we are doing is, and I apologize for having to be a little bit coy because it's not, we're not quite ready to announce, but we will be announcing soon that we are going to be working in partnership with the lead gardener of a quite famous, very climate forward garden, who is going to be partnering with us on the development of our conservation plan. And this is a garden that is also a historic site. And we are doing this through a preservation lens, but we also want to be very conscious of climate change and our planting practices, and how do we make responsible choices now to make sure that this century-old garden is here in another century. And so whether it's through that partnership or partnerships that we've had with local universities like the University of Oregon's preservation program, or a scientist that we've been working with more recently on figuring out how to care with our care for our oak trees. And that he's from Oregon State University. We have been trying as much as possible to tap into the skills and knowledge of our community, because there are a lot of talented, knowledgeable folks here who can help us figure out our path forward.
Great. Eileen, here's a question maybe the two of you together can field. How much is known about the original Olmsted plan, and how closely is that plan followed today?
Olmsted he suggested a place for the current house in the existing 18-year-old garden. He himself did not, except for things like, many of the things he suggested, Peter Kerr put in over time, like changing the dry gully into the Cascades. Let's see, there were some other things that changing the path that went straight down the western hillside that was curved, and it actually rises a little bit. I suspect some of the dirt from the excavation for the house was used to increase the height of that path a little bit. So he made suggestions that Peter Kerr mulled them over and decided whether he was going to implement them and when. So I couldn't say that Olmsted created a design for this garden per se, but he made some suggestions that Peter Kerr did put in place. There's never been, even Peter Kerr himself never had a clear plan for this property. He took it as it was, with the open space, which was used for different purposes over time, the tennis court, the golfing, driving range. But then he had the habit, he loved plants. He was a gardener and experimenter. He was always putting trees on the lawn. And then there's no written records of when he put those trees in. I only had like 1,000 photographic negatives to go through to try to figure out timing on some of these things. There was a giant Spanish chestnut on the lawn, huge, in the 1940s. Mrs. Kerr standing under this giant tree, and then it was gone. So we also have a problem here with ice storms in the winter. So you don't know if these things were damaged in ice storms and fell down, or if he just thought, well, that's too big, I'm going to plant something else. But it's interesting to me that he did come back to Olmsted, the firm, a couple of times, one for the possible development of the estate right before the Depression, and then earlier for some advice on tweaking what he had created here so it would be acceptable to the ladies of the Garden Club of America on their visit. So he did respect their advice a lot, or he would not have continued to go back to them for advice.
Here's another question from me. Just hearing you talk kind of sparked this idea of, like, I know kind of like crazy stories, or a piece of lore. Have you come across anything in your research that has stood out as an interesting tidbit or funny story? I'm sorry, I think my internet connection's breaking up.
I think I heard your question, Victoria, and I'm sure Eileen has other things that she could share. But one thing that Eileen shared with me that I thought was a pretty great story was that Mrs. Kerr was quite an accomplished competitive golfer, and she won numerous silver trophies for her golfing, and at one point had so many that she decided she had too many and chose to melt them down and have them turned into a punch bowl for parties, which is kind of a fun choice. Yeah.
Oh my
But
goodness.
Eileen, I know you are so well versed in the history of Elk Rock. Are there other anecdotes you can think of that stand out?
Well, his older daughter Anne did a lot of oral history recordings at the Oregon Historical Society, which are wonderful for her insights growing up here in the garden. And one of the things she said that her father, because Mrs. Kerr was not a gardener, but a dynamic golfer, but she loved to arrange flowers for the house. So Peter Kerr's goal was always to have something in the garden blooming, hopefully, so she could make arrangements year round. And Anne also said that one of the things he really loved to do was when he had lady visitors, he would walk through the garden with them and he would make little cuts of his plants that were blooming, and he'd make little bouquets to give to the ladies at the end of the walk. So he really loved to show and share the plants that he was growing, and he always wanted them to grow well. And this is a difficult site because it's rocky, the soil is thin, there's limited water, and the sun is off this property in the winter by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So he didn't get a piece of property that he might have wanted, which would be wonderful Willamette Valley River loam as deep as your elbow. But he made a really quite wonderful garden with a difficult site that he was given, and he never stopped gardening.
Yeah.
That feeds into this question, which asks, are there any unique plants at Elk Rock Garden?
I'm sorry,
Are there any
Unique plants?
unique plants?
plants? Well, there are Mish's two sequoias at the garden entrance. They're just enormous, giant sequoias. There is a shrub right outside the window here of the library that I'm in right now, that was on Mish's plans. There was a habit of that still continues. If you want to change a planting area and the plants are growing well, you don't just dig them up and throw them on the compost pile. You move them in the garden. So there are plants in this garden that were probably on Mish's planting plans, but they're not where he wanted them planted. There's a really beautiful deutzia shrub, huge, that has these beautiful white flowers in the spring, but it's out towards the dry end of the garden. It's very happy there, but Mish had shown it closer to the house. So these plants kind of get up like Burnham Woods in the night and move.
I would add to that, Victoria, that Peter had two daughters, Jane and Anne, who were both incredible gardeners in their own rights, and their gardens both exist to this day. In fact, earlier this year, we hosted a 3-garden tour where you could see all 3 Kerr family gardens in one day. And from talking to the current owner of Lady McDonald's garden, Anne's garden, there seem to be records that suggest that some of the plants in that garden are there because Peter gave cuttings to his daughter. And we have lost some plants over the years due to ice storms and changing conditions and what have you. And the current stewards of Lady McDonald's garden have been really generous with us in bringing cuttings of those plants back to us to sort of bring them full circle.
That's amazing. It's good to have good neighbors, right?
Yeah.
Here are some, well, here's kind of like a deeper question, and I don't know that you'll have an answer. What soil types exist at Elk Rock? I presume there are plenty of rocks. There was mulching used to improve soil. I guess for the wisteria in particular.
Well, basically we have a mix. I mean, not specifically here, but in this area of the Willamette Valley, we have a lot of clay, which is heavy, but it has a lot of nutrients in it. So you're always digging things into it, supplementing with compost and things like that to try to lighten it up a little bit. Here it's thin, but for 100 years, materials have been added to it. So it drains really well, which is really quite nice if you're used to gardening in clay, which kind of seizes up and cracks this time of year. But one of the things that Nico is doing is composting a lot of the leaves that come off the deciduous trees in the fall in enormous compost piles in the utility area. And those will probably go back onto the planting beds, especially places like there's a place called the Circle, which is big trees and a lot of rhododendrons. And then they could use a lot of mulch on them, especially this time of year. And the more mulch you put on, of course, the less water you have to use. So that's part of the, good gardening practices that you try to follow here. So it's probably clay, sometimes with pockets of river gravel, but up this high, probably not. It's just thin and well drained.
I would just add to that. Nico is our gardener. I think neither of us actually stated that earlier. His background is in conservation ecology, and one of the things that he is really focused on here, in addition to just caring for the garden in general, is to make it as healthy and vibrant of a habitat as possible. And so we in previous years, they were bringing in a lot of compost. As Eileen said, we've been trying to make our own. In fact, we were adopted by an Eagle Scout who's building us some giant compost bins, which is pretty exciting for us. But Nico has been doing some interesting things on the property. Our property is sort of broken into two chunks. There's more of a formal cultivated garden portion of the property, and then the other portion of the property. On the Olmsted drawing, it just says the wild. It's always been a wooded area. There are paths that cut through, but there's no irrigation out there, and it hasn't been cultivated. We have a lot of invasives out there and don't have the healthiest understory necessarily. And so Nico and our two interns spent the winter removing a lot of invasives and starting to plant native plants to try and help the understory bounce back. The other project that they were working on over the winter that has been fun to see is we have a large portion of lawn called the Grand Lawn, which is the major open space. And then the second portion of the lawn we call the South Lawn. And we've been experimenting out on the South Lawn with converting that grass to a native wildflower meadow. We got that planted early, basically this winter, and early this spring it started blooming for the first time, and it's doing really well. It is kind of cordoned off with some twine, and it is escaping its boundaries, which is what we would like to see, and we hope that it will continue. We're seeing a lot more butterflies, hummingbirds, and pollinators flocking to that area of the garden now.
Beautiful landscape. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. We're so excited that the Olmsted Network is coming here in September. We can't wait to see you all and host you here, and are looking forward to the conference. It's really exciting.
Oh, yay. I bet we're more excited than you are, but we'll keep there. And thank you all again, and thank you all for attending.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.